In today's video, we'll be discussing classical Marxism, a political and socioeconomic philosophy developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the mid-19th century. At its core, Marxism provides a critical analysis of capitalism and a theory of social change, underpinned by concepts such as historical materialism, class struggle, alienation of labor, and revolutionary praxis. From the Cold War to the Russian Revolution, Marxism and its derivative variants have played a large part in shaping international relations, social movements, and structures of governance over the last century. Depending on what country you live in, the name Karl Marx might evoke within you either feelings of disgust and fear, or inspiration and patriotism. Most governments position themselves either in relation or opposition to his views on capitalism. In the Western context, the word Marxism has been flattened to a sort of political buzzword, synonymous with all things evil and un-American. But considering the influence of this school of thought, we owe it to ourselves to ask, what constitutes Marxist ideology? We should begin with a recognition of the fact that Marx's critique of capitalism was developed in the 1800s, a time when capitalism was far more raw, brutal, and unregulated. Children were working and dying in mines for pennies a day. There was no minimum wage, and no workers' compensation. Factory workers were putting in 12-hour workdays with no mandates for breaks and little remuneration. Such terrible conditions created many critics and enemies. The early 19th century saw the development of various socialist, communist, and workers' movements, each which sought to address the various injustices faced by the working class. Marx and Engels were commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto by the Communist League, an international association of workers, reflecting the rise of organized political action among the working class. Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in Trier, Prussia, now Germany. He came from a middle-class family and was educated at home until he went to the University of Bonn to study law at the age of 17. After 1 year at Bonn, he moved to the University of Berlin. In Berlin, Marx became interested in the philosophy of Hegel and joined a group of radical thinkers known as the Young Hegelians. After earning his doctorate in philosophy, Marx moved to Paris, but he was expelled from the city due to his radical writing and communist organizing. Marx spent much of his life stateless and in poverty, having made many enemies in high places due to his biting and incessant criticism of European elites. Marx's life seems to have been an uncomfortable one. He was chronically and painfully ill, notoriously irritable, and very fond of drinking. Perhaps the best account of Marx's personality comes from a report compiled by a Prussian spy. As stated in the report, Marx's intellectual superiority exercises an irresistible force on his surroundings. In his private life, he is highly disorderly, a cynical human being, and a bad manager. He lives the life of an intellectual bohemian. Washing, combing, and changing his linen are things he does rarely. He likes to get drunk. He is often idle for days on end, but when he has work to do, he will work day and night with tireless endurance. He will often stay up the whole night and then lie down on the sofa, fully dressed around midday, and sleep till evening, untroubled by the fact that the whole world comes and goes through his room. In classical Marxist thought, it's all about the economy. Marx's analysis of social change is called historical materialism. Historical materialism provides a framework for analyzing social and economic development. This view of social change divides society into two primary parts, the base and the superstructure. For Marx, the base of social life is the economic relations of a society, defined by the forces of production. This includes the tools, techniques, and forms of labor organization in society. The superstructure is pretty much everything else. Politics, religion, and even family arrangements stem from the base. According to historical materialism, the defining feature of social change is the conflict between those who own the forces of production, the bourgeoisie, and those who sell their labor for wages, the proletariat. Marx argued that the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie drive historical change in society. Marx believed that change results from the development of the forces of production. Society changes when its mode of economic production changes. When the forces of production come into conflict with the social relations of production, this creates a tension, which drives revolution and social development. It is, however, important to note that social change can also be held back by the superstructure, which has the ability to address and mitigate these economic tensions via non-material pathways. Central to Marxism is the concept of class struggle. Marxism views society as being divided into economic classes based not on their net worth, but on their relationship to the means of production. The capitalist class, or bourgeoisie, benefits by exploiting the labor power of the proletariat working class. They pay the proletariat wages in return for their labor time. On the other hand, the working class, or proletariat, does not own the means of production. Therefore, they must sell their labor to the capitalist class. Marx argued that the relationship between the two classes is inherently exploitative, as the bourgeoisie derives its wealth from the labor of the proletariat. This class conflict is reflected in the concept of surplus labor value, as introduced in Marx's 1867 magnum opus, Das Kapital. Marx's theory of surplus labor value holds that the actual value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Surplus value refers to the difference between the value that the workers produce through their labor and the wages that they are paid by their employers. In simpler terms, it's the value of the workers' output over and above the cost of their labor power. If a worker is paid for an 8-hour workday, for example, but creates enough value to cover his wage in 4 hours, then the value that the worker produces in his remaining 4 hours is surplus value. According to Marx, this surplus value is appropriated by the capitalist class as profit. Because the capitalist must maximize profits, this creates a natural tension between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie aims to keep wages low to boost their profits, while the proletariat seeks higher wages and better working conditions. Marx theorized that this economic tension would ultimately lead to a revolution, where the proletariat rises against the bourgeoisie. The resulting social change, Marx argued, would see the end of capitalism and the birth of socialism, a society where the means of production are collectively owned by the proletariat. The suggestion of Marxism is that the role of the capitalist is socially unnecessary and, in fact, harmful and parasitic. Marx believed that the capitalist could be replaced by a workers' council, which would assume the duties of the capitalist by democratically coordinating and protecting the interests of the firm. Basically, the business would be run by a labor union instead of a CEO. According to Marx, at any given point, there is a supply and demand mismatch between people who need jobs and the number of jobs available. This competition between workers for a limited number of jobs allows the capitalist to drive down wages by simply replacing employees who demand a higher pay. Now, Marx's analysis is heavily slanted towards the economy, but as a political project, a key part of Marxism is its attempt at a moral and ethical appeal. This is evident in the concept of alienation. For Marx, alienation refers to the idea that in a capitalist society, workers are estranged from key aspects of their humanity. Marx believed this alienation occurred in 4 different ways. First, Marx claimed that, in capitalist workplaces, the worker is alienated from the product of his own labor. In a capitalist system, workers don't own the products they produce. Instead, these products are sold as commodities, typically benefiting the capitalist more than the worker. As a result, workers might feel that the products they produce with their labor are foreign or even hostile to them, as the value they produce only increases the power that the capitalist holds over them. The second form of alienation Marx identified is alienation from the process of production. Typically, workers in a capitalist society do not control the production process. Rather, they sell their labor and usually participate in a small, repetitive segment of the production process. For example, a factory worker might spend all day applying the same stitch to hundreds of identical garments. This can lead to a sense of disconnection and dissatisfaction, because the workers are unable to fully express their creativity, skills, and ingenuity through their work, which may be tedious, menial, and performed in isolation. Third, Marx discussed alienation from others. Marx believed that the capitalist system creates competition among workers for jobs and wages, which can prevent the formation of genuine, community-based connections and contribute to feelings of isolation. Immigration might be the classic case of this, where immigrants are greeted with hostility because they are seen as competitors for scarce jobs, rather than potential friends and neighbors. Finally, and probably most confusingly, Marx referred to alienation from one's own species essence. Marx borrows the term species essence from Ludwig Feuerbach, who used the term to critique the theological notion that humans had fallen from a state of perfect unity with their species essence. For Feuerbach, returning to our species essence was to recognize our shared humanity and move away from the idea of a personal God. When Marx refers to alienation from one's species essence, he's discussing how the conditions of labor under capitalism prevent individuals from realizing their true human nature. Workers in a capitalist system are often required to perform repetitive, unfulfilling tasks and follow orders in order to survive, which contradicts their nature as creative, productive, and autonomous humans. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels argue that overcoming this alienation would require the abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of a socialist or communist system. In such a system, the workers would control the means of production, which would enable them to connect more meaningfully with their work, the products of their labor, and each other. One of the biggest things people tend to miss about Marx, however, is that Marx didn't actually regard capitalism as some sort of terrible, evil mistake. For Marx, capitalism was a necessary bridge between feudalism and a socialist future. Marx recognized that the incredible productive forces of capitalism, although hostile to the worker, played an essential role in moving humanity beyond the archaic feudal societies of the pre-modern period. Marx believed that capitalism, just like feudalism, creates within itself a number of internal contradictions that will inevitably lead to its collapse. Now, we'd really need another video to properly get into this, so I'll just give you one example. Marx identified a contradiction between capital and labor. In order to increase profits, capitalists aim to keep labor costs low, which means paying workers low wages. This results in workers not having enough money to buy the goods and services that are produced, leading to overproduction and economic crisis. This is sometimes referred to as the problem of underconsumption. Now, the most controversial part of Marxism is its relationship with social revolution. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels argue that the exploitation and contradictions of capitalism will eventually lead to a revolution in which the proletariat will rise against the bourgeoisie. The manifesto famously begins by stating, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," emphasizing the inherent conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx and Engels call on the proletariat to organize together in order to overthrow the capitalist class, seizing the means of production for themselves. They argue that, as capitalism evolves, it intensifies the exploitation of the proletariat, worsening their living conditions and increasing their dissatisfaction. At the same time, capitalism creates its own gravediggers by bringing together the proletariat in large numbers and giving them a common experience of exploitation. Marx and Engels claimed that this process would make workers increasingly aware of their shared interests and their potential as an organized working class. In Marxism, this recognition of shared interests is called class consciousness. The obvious example of class consciousness in action is the formation of labor unions. Labor unions are organizations formed by workers who come together to achieve common goals, such as improving safety standards, securing better wages, benefits, and working conditions. Labor unions are thus a manifestation of the workers' recognition of their shared economic interests, as well as their capacity to leverage collective bargaining power in order to negotiate with their employers. The goal of the Communist Manifesto is to provide the intellectual foundations for a social revolution which would yield a communist society. But what actually is communism? Well, it kind of depends who you ask, but Marx and Engels envisioned it as a classless, stateless society, where the means of production are owned and controlled by the community as a whole. It's a society where the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need applies. In other words, in communism, every individual in society contributes to the best of their ability, and in return, each individual's economic needs are met. Marx and Engels also describe an intermediary period after the revolution. This is known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this stage, the working class holds political power and uses it to strip the bourgeoisie of their power and wealth. It's important to note that the dictatorship here is not a dictatorship in the modern sense of the term, but rather rule by a class, the proletariat, as opposed to the previous rule by the bourgeoisie. This dictatorship of the proletariat basically has the features of big government that we've come to commonly associate with modern communism, such as the nationalization of banks and private industry, as well as universal healthcare and free education. Marxism would prove to be an enormously transformative force throughout the 20th century. It directly inspired the Russian Revolution of 1917, leading to the establishment of a socialist state, which would eventually become the USSR. It also played a key ideological role in the Chinese Revolution of 1949, led by Mao Zedong, resulting in the establishment of the modern Chinese Communist Party. Another example was the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro in 1959, which soured US relations with the country for decades. The Vietnam War was an explicit attempt by the United States to stop the spread of Marxist ideology in Southeast Asia during the height of the Cold War tensions with the USSR. Marxism has also proven influential within the West, influencing labor union leaders like Eugene Debs and the Black Panthers movement. Basically, it's not possible to understate the impact that Marxism has had on the world we live in now. The simple, populistic nature of Marx's analysis makes him a natural reference for insurgent political movements aimed at destabilizing the status quo. No matter where you stand on Marx, You're better off just familiarizing yourself with this ideology, because it's unlikely that the world will stop talking about it anytime soon. Now, obviously, Marxism has not been without its critics. Many have dismissed it as utopian. Within sociology, the complaints that most commonly come up are Marx's economic determinism and class reductionism. With respect to the former, it is argued that Marx's historical materialism places too much emphasis on the economy and material conditions as the driving force of history and human behavior. Later Marxist writers have addressed this. If you're interested in that, you could check out the work of Antonio Gramsci, in particular his concept of cultural hegemony. With respect to class reductionism, it has been argued that Marx's focus on class struggle minimizes other sources of identity and conflict, such as race, gender, and ethnicity. We might ask why economics serves as the base of social relations, rather than any of these other aspects of identity and social position. Anyway, that's just the basics of Marxism. I hope you guys learned something, and stay tuned for the next video.